Tiberius rules Rome, the second man now to serve as princeps, a new autocratic ruler with a lifetime term, an all-powerful guardian to keep the Republic from descending into civil war. But Tiberius seemed a reluctant emperor. He refused titles and honors, undermining his own regime's propaganda. He lacked patience for senatorial politics, alienating the Roman nobility. And in the year AD 26, just 12 years into his reign, he abandoned Rome forever. The imperial capital was rudderless, and into the void stepped the praetorian prefect Sejanus. And he seems to have had a plan to become Tiberius's heir and the next Roman emperor. Would this plan succeed? Find out on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 10, An Age of Conspiracies. Before we begin, I'd just like to issue another reminder that Friday, September 22nd, I'll be featured on the Ask Historians Reddit as the host of an Ask Me Anything. Now, that doesn't mean you can actually ask me anything, but you can ask me anything about Roman history, and I'll be sure to answer those questions. That'll be all day, Friday the 22nd, on the Ask Historians subreddit. You can just go to Reddit and type in Ask Historians, or you can type Ask Historians Reddit into any search engine. All right, on with the show. In the years after Tiberius took over from Augustus, the new princeps designated two different heirs. The first was his nephew and adopted son Germanicus, a wildly popular general who met a strange and tragic end in the distant east, maybe even poisoned by Tiberius's own orders. But the letter signed by Tiberius ordering Germanicus's death is still missing to this day, like some list of famous visitors to a remote island has disappeared from history. Tiberius's second heir was his own son, Drusus, an experienced leader, but with one major weakness. His wife evidently had a wandering eye. We don't know who seduced who, or perhaps the relationship was as much a political partnership as a romance, but either way, her new lover, Sejanus, convinced her to poison her own husband. Who was this man, Sejanus? As I've said before, he was the praetorian prefect, the leader of the praetorian guard. The praetorian guard were the personal soldiers of the emperor. They numbered around 1 legion, that is about 4,000 to 5,000 men in total. They were the only soldiers legally allowed to bear weapons inside the sacred boundary of Rome. Most praetorians were military veterans, personally recommended to the emperor by his generals or his officers. These were Rome's most elite and versatile soldiers. But they were also sent on unique missions, from espionage to assassinations. Praetorians were ever in the emperor's shadow, and the praetorian prefect, Sejanus at this point, came to know more about Tiberius than just about anyone else. So when Tiberius left for his island retreat at Capri in AD 26, Sejanus became a kind of representative and messenger for the emperor. He would journey back and forth from Rome to Capri. Historians suspect Sejanus used the emperor's isolation to feed both Tiberius and the Senate selective tidbits of information, and ultimately increase his own influence and improve his own position. Sejanus worked to undermine Tiberius's family members and his potential heirs. The most prominent of these were the 3 sons of the late Germanicus, the youngest of whom, as I said last time, was the boy Caligula. Now, our details are fuzzy, but in AD 28, the Senate brought charges against Germanicus's widow and one of Caligula's older brothers. Both of these people were exiled. A few years later, the eldest of Germanicus's sons was then exiled. So that's 2 out of the 3 sons, just Caligula's left. And both Caligula's older brothers then conveniently died under mysterious circumstances. Our sources suggest different modes of death, the most prominent being that they were imprisoned in a room until they starved. Germanicus's widow may have had an even worse death. She was tortured until she died. Caligula's eldest brothers had reached the age of manhood, but Caligula was still a teenager, and therefore he was unable to take up any inheritance. And perhaps this is one reason why he managed to survive at least this initial effort to eliminate Tiberius's heirs. Well, Tiberius also decided to have Caligula brought almost as a prisoner to his palace in Capri. The move probably ended up protecting Caligula from assassination, but at the same time, the boy spent his formative adolescent years trapped among the insane and excessive debaucheries of his elderly uncle. Sources suggest that Tiberius's island was far worse than that modern island destination I've mentioned a few times on this podcast. Now, some of the details of what Tiberius got up to in Capri are recorded in the biography of the imperial secretary Suetonius. These details are too perverse to actually read aloud on this podcast and maintain its reputation for providing PG content. I'll link to that source in the show note page for those that have a strong stomach. So the life of young Caligula was both saved and probably ruined at the same time. And we will see the effects of Caligula's troubled years in Capri in the coming episodes. Now, back in Rome, it became increasingly clear that Tiberius was never going to come back. This left Rome available to be taken. Now, not by force. Tiberius still commanded the legions, even though he didn't take the title of imperator. But if someone could rule in Tiberius's name, that individual's power in the city would be unrivaled. Who took that opportunity? You know, it was Sejanus. Tiberius's absence allowed Sejanus to fortify his position as a kind of de facto ruler in Rome. Members of the Senate knew how to read the situation. They were political veterans. They could adjust to shifts in power. And Sejanus' star was obviously rising and fast. So the Senate began to give their imprimatur to Sejanus' unofficial position as second in command of the empire. The Senate voted statues to be raised, both to Tiberius and Sejanus. They made Sejanus' birthday a holiday. Sacrifices were made to his continued health and safety. His image was carried by legions across the empire. These are not normal honors for somebody who is not in the imperial family. In fact, Sejanus wasn't even a senator at this point. But it seems that Tiberius approved and maybe even endorsed these honors because in AD 31, Tiberius used his imperial authority to make Sejanus consul, despite Sejanus not having any of the required prerequisites to hold the highest office. And Tiberius himself would serve as the other consul. And the Senate went further. They passed a decree preemptively making Sejanus and Tiberius consuls every 5 years. If Sejanus was going to rise any higher, it would likely be full adoption as Tiberius's heir. I imagine at this point, he could probably almost taste it. But that same year, AD 31, Tiberius's grandnephew, Caligula, reached age 18. And this is the Roman age of manhood. And so now Tiberius had a choice to make at this point. On the one hand, he could adopt Sejanus as his heir, and this would be a move that would put young Caligula in danger of eventual assassination, probably after Tiberius died. Sejanus would need to have all the loose ends tied up. Tiberius knew this would be the case because that seems to be exactly what happened after Augustus died and his extended family were conveniently murdered. Or Tiberius could go the other way. He could make the now 18-year-old Caligula his adopted son. But there were problems with this option. Sejanus was now independently powerful. He was consul. His image was carried around by the troops. He was integrated into Roman religion. He had the backing of the Senate, and he was prefect of Tiberius's own praetorian guard. It would not have been difficult at all for Sejanus to give an assassination order to one of his soldiers and engineer a full-on coup. Tiberius had a tough decision, but Tiberius would make that decision, and he crafted a plan to carry it out. The emperor sent a letter to the Senate, and Sejanus was made to believe that this letter contained the news that he had been waiting for, that new powers would place him as an equal to Tiberius. Sejanus bolted to the Senate house to hear the news read in person. And when he entered the doors, his praetorian guards were informed that rewards were waiting for them back in their camp, and not to worry about Sejanus because in their place, the town watchmen. This was a force of basically firefighters and what you might call peace officers in the city of Rome. Not really professional soldiers, but nevertheless men who could be relied upon for security. Sejanus was told that those men would keep order in the city and guard the Senate house while the Senate met. The praetorians were probably still on the march back to camp when the letter was finally read in the Senate house. And instead of containing new honors for Sejanus, it was a warrant for his immediate arrest. The town watch had been given orders to take Sejanus into custody in the Senate house. And as the senator Cassius Dio records in his history of the period, senators immediately turned on Sejanus. Quote, "For the man whom at dawn they had escorted to the Senate hall as a superior being, they were now dragging to prison. On him who they had previously thought worthy of many crowns, they now laid bonds. Him who they had wont to protect as a master, they now guarded like a runaway slave. Him whom they had adorned with the purple-bordered toga, they struck in the face. And him whom they were wont to adore and worship with sacrifices as a god, they were now leading to execution." That's Cassius Dio's Roman history. That morning, Sejanus had been second in command. Only Tiberius had outranked him. But by evening, he was dead. Sejanus was executed by strangulation. And if the praetorians had any desire to avenge their prefect, it was largely mollified by a reward indeed waiting back at their camps. Tiberius gave each and every one a huge cash bonus. But some praetorians, however, thought they were owed a little bit more, and they took to the streets to loot their own city. The sudden death of Sejanus had created enough panic in Rome that opportunistic inhabitants thought it a good time to riot, and some of the praetorians went ahead and joined them. The dramatic events of the day Sejanus died reinforced a reality that should never have been forgotten. Although he was away from Rome, Tiberius was still emperor. Although the praetorians may have been loyal to their prefect, their loyalty could also be bought, and no one could outbid the emperor. Although the Senate retained its noble reputation and status, its members were mere men, and often cowards at that. Men willing to toss aside their convictions and abandon those whom they once had honored if the balance of power changed one way or the other. This was the Rome of the Pax Romana. Yes, the empire faced no serious outside foreign challenges, and thus was nominally at peace. But the cancer of corruption was firmly entrenched in the Eternal City already, even this early in the Pax Romana story. And that cancer was going to metastasize. Sejanus must have been at least partly behind the Senate's push to exile the family members of Germanicus. And although Sejanus was now dead, prosecutions had given the Senate a new purpose while the Emperor Tiberius was away. And so political trials became a regular fixture of the remaining years of Tiberius's reign. Initially, the Senate prosecuted just the family and friends of Sejanus. His children, for example, all violently murdered. But there was a lot of money to be made in these trials. Senators paid out large rewards to informants, who soon began passing on even the most innocuous bits of gossip and rumor There had been several conspiracies over the past few years, some real, some imagined, and senators began to fall all over themselves to signal that they were innocent. And they did this by prosecuting their friends and their colleagues. An atmosphere of contagious paranoia rocked Rome's Senate. And once all the most obvious conspiracies were exhausted, the Senate widened the scope for treason to really any word or comment spoken badly about the emperor. Now, the logic here was in part religious. If Tiberius was son of the god Augustus, and himself destined to one day become divine after his death, then to speak against Tiberius was sacrilege. Kind of makes sense. And sacrilege in the Roman mind always brought about divine punishments. So the Roman Senate really had a duty to root out any disloyalty and punish such with maximum effect. Now, Tiberius, of course, would have heard about these trials, and he could have stopped them, but for the most part, he allowed them to carry on for years. Sometimes he would grant a pardon to somebody who was convicted, but many senators were tried and executed on very flimsy charges. Tiberius seemed to enjoy the way that Rome's nobles debased themselves. Such, at least, is what Tacitus claims. Quote, "So corrupted indeed and debased was that age of sycophancy that not only the foremost citizens were forced to save their grandeur by servility, but every ex-consul, most of the ex-praetors, and a host of inferior senators would rise in eager rivalry to propose shameful and preposterous motions." There's a story that whenever Tiberius left the Senate house, he used to say in Greek, "Men fit for slavery." Even he, who opposed public freedom, clearly was tired of such groveling endurance in his slaves. That's Tacitus's Annals. Around the year AD 35, Tiberius finally named heirs, and two of them, Caligula, son of Germanicus, was now 22 years old, and Gemellus, son of Tiberius's own son, Drusus, but Gemellus was underage, just 15 years old, and still legally a boy. And then 2 years later, in AD 37, when Tiberius was either 77 or maybe 78 years old, the emperor caught a terrible sickness, one that wasted him away. And that same year, 37 BC, Rome's second emperor, Tiberius, would die. But unlike Augustus, who was mourned, honored, and eventually divinized, we're told by the Roman biographer Suetonius that, quote, "The people were so glad of Tiberius's death that at the first news of it some ran about shouting, 'Tiberius to the Tiber,' while others prayed to Mother Earth and to the Manes to allow the dead man no abode except among the damned. Still others threatened his body with the hook and the stairs of mourning." That's Suetonius's Life of Tiberius. What do some of those things mean? Tiberius to the Tiber might be obvious. This is a cry to have the emperor's body thrown into the river, like a common criminal. But even worse were the calls for the hook and the stairs of mourning. The hook refers to the practice of dragging a body through the streets by a hook, a gruesome and degrading way to die. It's an open question as to whether it's worse than the stairs of mourning. These were a flight of stairs that led into the Roman Forum. They're very public. And many of those who were convicted and executed for treason under Tiberius had been left to rot and be eaten by animals along those steps. And now, ironically, calls were made for Tiberius's body to share the same fate. Under Tiberius, the faux republican veneer that Augustus had carefully crafted and applied was finally stripped bare. Tiberius's corrupt reign exposed the new regime for exactly what it was, an absolutist autocracy. The emperor could get away with murder. He was not bound by the law. The Senate were not the noble guardians of a restored republic, but they were self-serving sycophants, if not outright slaves, as Tiberius had called them. This new regime was not preserving the Roman Republic. It had murdered it, and it was now desecrating Rome's remaining legacy. But the evils of Tiberius would very quickly be forgotten. A new emperor was in charge, Caligula. He had been well trained in the worst debaucheries of Tiberius. But whereas Tiberius had kept his dark secrets hidden with him at Capri, Caligula held no such scruples. The new emperor was so debased and so public about it at the same time that many believed Caligula not just evil, but insane. Was Rome now truly in the hands of a madman? Find out on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.